Can Congress declare war on Russia? No, because we've signed treaties saying we will only declare war on a country that poses an immediate national security threat to the United States. Does Russia pose such a threat to the United States? No. The United States poses such a threat to Russia because we have $50 billion worth of equipment on the ground in Ukraine shooting at Russian boys so that Joe Biden can run for re-election as a wartime president. Did Congress authorize the killing of Russian boys? Did Congress declare war? No and no. But it did give Joe Biden a blank check. So Congress will allow him to fight an undeclared war. Are there American troops on the ground? Depends how you define it. If you define troops on the ground as guys in uniform and in boots and carrying weapons, the answer is no. If you define boots on the ground as guys wearing boots and weapons and out of uniform, the answer is yes. There are American troops there, and they're pulling triggers that send American-made projectiles to kill Russian boys. What do you expect the Russians to do about it? Does the United States pose a military threat to Russia? You can answer that for yourself. We have nuclear warheads in Italy aimed at Moscow. We have nuclear warheads in the Netherlands aimed at Moscow. We have intercontinental ballistic missiles in Germany and in Poland aimed at Moscow. As far as I know, the Russians don't have anything in Mexico or Canada, but you can imagine how we would react if they did. And NATO? Oh, NATO just keeps moving closer and closer to Moscow. If you get a chance, read an English translation, unless you're fluent in Russian, of Vladimir Putin's speech to the Duma, more or less his State of the Union speech on February, I forget it was 21st or 22nd. It was one of the most rational speeches ever given by a head of state in the modern era. Rational, tempered, moderate of tone. He truly believes that the West is the cause of this, and we know the West is. Yeah. Maybe if George H.W. were still around, he would recognize, yes, we promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 800 miles eastward, and it did. And the weapons are there, and they're aimed at Moscow. And people like the president of Poland wants to use those weapons because he somehow thinks that Crimea can be liberated from the Russians. I mean, this is like Texas would be liberated from the Americans and returned to Mexico. I mean, it makes as much sense. Does the United States pose a threat to Russia? Yes, it does. We are training Ukrainian pilots to fly American jets, which will attack Russia. There is zero American national security interest in providing weapons and cash to Ukraine. We have no dog in this fight and should have zero interest in the outcome. These two countries have been disputing for 300 years over whether the land that Putin seeks is part of Russia or part of Ukraine. And the overwhelming number of persons who live in this land are Russian-speaking and are happy to be a part of Russia. All we're doing is extending a war and causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine and the destruction of a once beautiful country. Although the government is authoritarian, the country is beautiful and the people are peaceful, but you're not seeing that now. You're seeing a people whipped into a frenzy. We have 100,000 troops in Europe at the ready. We have 40,000 troops in Poland, right over the Polish-Ukraine border, training with 90,000 Polish troops. Their commander-in-chief, the president of Poland, is crazy. He wants an invasion of Ukraine by American and Polish and Romanian troops. The rest of NATO is not going to get involved in this because they see right through it. And he thinks that we can, in that invasion, expel Russia from the portions of Ukraine that it now dominates, the eastern portion, and even take back Crimea, which Russia captured in 2014 after the CIA fomented a revolution and a coup in Ukraine. Today is the 80th anniversary of the Russian victory in Stalingrad that repelled the Nazi invasion of Russia and turned the tide of World War II against the Russians. President Putin celebrated that victory today, as he should, and in his speech made some very strong comments about the United States and about the West and about what they're trying to do.
Невероятно. Невероятно, но факт. Нам снова угрожают немецкими танками «Леопард», на борту которых кресты. И вновь собираются воевать с Россией на земле Украины руками.
It's incredible, he says. We are being attacked by the West in the name of people who are the followers of Hitler and Bandera. Bandera is a Ukrainian Nazi who whispers ideological theories into President Zelensky's ear. He sees what's going on. Putin gets it. He sees the West trying to gang up on him, and he sees the West trying to force him into using weapons that he doesn't want to use. On top of all of this, Trey Yingst just did a fascinating interview with President Zelensky. I want to reach them. I want them to be afraid of us. He wants to use American and NATO hardware to attack Russia. Mr. President, are you out of your mind? Do you really want American missiles and ammunition reaching deep into Russia? Do you really trust President Zelensky and his Nazi cohorts attacking Russia with things on it that say made in USA? Are you not fearful of what the reaction to that might be? Do you really want to push Putin, President Biden? Are you crazy? Do you really want to start a war with Vladimir Putin? Don't bring us into another Vietnam. Don't borrow another $1 trillion like George W. Bush did to bring us into an invasion of Afghanistan, fruitless and useless, or another $1 trillion to invade Baghdad, fruitless and useless, and his father $1 trillion, George H.W. Bush, for his invasion of Baghdad because Saddam Hussein tried to take back territory that was stolen from him. I don't want to repeat history here, but this nonsense about domino theories, if Russia expands, it'll eventually be in Baltimore. Same argument Bush's father made about Iraq expanding. Same argument that you're making now, Mr. President, about Russia expanding. It's nonsense. Putin wants a prosperous country that will interact with the West diplomatically and commercially. He doesn't want war, and he doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. And you, Mr. President, are the one that is pushing him there. It's time to recognize that your foreign policy in Ukraine is an utter failure, Mr. President. It's time to take a material step back. Bring the American troops that are in Poland and they're ready to attack home. Bring the troops that are on the ground and out of uniform in Ukraine home. Send the CIA home.
I don't like the fact that America is bearing the brunt and the burden of financing most of the war against Putin in Ukraine. I think we agree on that part. Why isn't Europe, why don't they ever step up and defend their own continent before they ask for U.S. involvement? And why would Joe Biden veto Poland, given Zelensky fighter jets to actually fight to win the war after they were invaded?
Well, the more disturbing thing is that on 2 occasions, the Russians tried to sign a peace agreement with Zelensky.
Do you trust Putin?
Do I trust Putin? No, but that's not. Listen, I've litigated over 500 lawsuits. All of them end up with, or many of them end up with settlements of one kind or the other. And you never trust the guy on the other side. You use language art, and you use the design of agreements.
So Ukraine, to appease Putin, who I think is evil, they've already given up Crimea. It was annexed. So what? Now they have to give up the Donbas area?
Ukraine, because of our pushing the Ukraine into the war on 2 occasions.
We pushed them into it, or did Putin?
Well, let me tell you. Let me answer your question.
Yeah.
In 2019, France, Germany, and Russia all agreed to the Minsk Accords. That year, Zelensky ran for president. He was a comedian. He had no political experience. Why did he win? Because he ran on one issue, signing the Minsk Accords. As soon as he got in there, Victoria Nuland in the White House told him he couldn't do it. Then Putin sends 40,000 troops in. That's not enough to conquer the country. Clearly, he wanted us to come to the negotiation. He wanted somebody to come to the negotiating table. Zelensky came to the negotiating table, signed a new agreement that was the Minsk Accords 2 in 2022, and that would have allowed Donbas to stay, and Lugansk to remain as part of Ukraine. We said Putin signed it, Zelensky initialed it, and Putin, in good faith, began withdrawing troops from the Ukraine. What happened? We sent Boris Johnson over there to torpedo it because we don't want peace we want the war with Russia.
Why are you blaming America's role in this? Look, Putin to me is an evil, murdering dictator thug, and when he leaves this earth, nobody's going to miss him. Let's be honest. However, I think that Europe has a responsibility to protect their continent, and yet it always seems to fall on the United States. Joe Biden has committed all these billions of dollars that we can't afford, and he's not fighting the war to win the war. I don't believe in fighting wars half-assed. If you're going to fight a war, you go in, overwhelming force, you beat them, you get the hell out. That's it, and only if it's provoked. Putin did not need to invade a sovereign country, in my view. Is Zelensky perfect? Nope. I don't think he is either. I agree with you on that part. But America's role, I think, should be dictated first by Europe. And they've got to defend their continent. And they haven't stepped up, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think most of the European countries wanted the war either. It's clear what happened, which is that, from the beginning, we promised in 1992, the Russian leadership said, we will move. This was Gorbachev said when the Soviet Union, he was getting ready to dismantle the Soviet Union, and he said, we're going to withdraw 400,000 troops from East Germany. And we're going to allow you to reunite Germany under NATO, which is a hostile army. That's a huge concession for them. The one commitment that we want, is what the Russians said, is that you will not move NATO to the east. James Baker, who was then Secretary of State under Bush, famously promised, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles in 14 countries. Now, when we started that plan in 1997, Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, said to the Clinton administration, if you move NATO to the east, I'm resigning because you are forcing the Russians to come to war with us. George Kennan, who was the most important diplomat in American history, the architect of the containment policy during World War II, said the same thing. You do not need to make an enemy out of Russia. Russia should be treated the way we won the Cold War.
It gets complicated. Let me ask you a question. China's been showing nothing but hostility. COVID, intellectual property theft, unfair trade practices. They've been confronting our Navy ships in international waterways. They've been confronting our fighter jets in international airways. They had the spy drone fly all around the country, and no, Joe didn't shoot it down. They threatened to shoot hypersonic missiles at the U.S. They're threatening to take out Taiwan and take over Taiwan. They call it reunification. If you're president, would you come to the defense of Taiwan, our ally?
Well, no presidential candidate with any prudence would answer that question. Our policy towards Taiwan is strategic ambiguity, and that makes a lot of sense. You don't want to project your enemy what you're going to do in a certain case, or embolden your friends to go to war thinking that you're going to support them. So that's been our policy, and it's a sensible policy.
Do you see China as our top geopolitical foe? They're also trying to undermine the U.S. dollar. Yes. You do.
Yeah, and that's why that's another reason why the war in Ukraine is insane, because we have pushed China into the
Donald Trump said he can resolve the issue. Do you think you can create a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
I think we have to. There's no choice. Russia's not going to lose this war. Russia can't afford it. This would be like us losing a war to Mexico. They are not going to lose the war. Go look at what Russia did in Stalingrad in order to preserve its territorial integrity. Russia's been invaded 3 times through the Ukraine. The last time, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. They're 400 miles from Moscow. We already have Aegis missile systems within 12 minutes of Moscow. We wouldn't tolerate that if the Russians did it in 1962 when they put them in Cuba. My uncle was going to invade if they. I
want to talk a little bit about your background growing up, your uncle as president.
I'm about to go crazy sitting here on the earphone hearing the stuff you all are saying about the Ukraine. I'm about to have a heart attack, but I'm not even going to go into it. I'm from the Ukraine. The Ukrainian, there is a large faction of Nazis. I don't know if you know this, but there's a large amount of Nazis in the Ukraine, and they actually killed my whole family. I'm from the Ukraine, and they marched my entire family, grandmothers, great-grandparents, 10 siblings out into the forest and buried them alive in the Ukraine. So I don't understand why everybody's Ukraine. Well, I do understand, and that's also what terrifies me. People better wake up and do some research on their own instead of buying what comes across on the screen. And I try to shake them up, Pierce. You're goddamn right I do. I try to shake them up and crack their mind control programming. I do it for God.
You're perfectly entitled to your views. I would say in relation to the suggestion that they're all a bunch of Nazis.
You haven't seen the swastikas on those soldiers' arms. It's in the news.
President Zelensky himself is Jewish, so obviously he is de facto not a Nazi.
I know, but he's not a good one. Are all Jews the same? For God's sake, talk about anti-Semitic. Just because a guy's a Jew doesn't mean he likes Jews or that he's doing anything good for the Jews. I mean, so what? Who cares what anybody is? That was the whole point of my tweet. just because they're skin folk don't mean they're kin folk. You know what I mean? Just because they're the same color as you don't mean they ain't trying to lock your ass up. Wake up, people! Snap out of it.